My name is Devin Judge Lord. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm going to present some research recently published in the journal Organization and Environment with my co-authors Ben Cashore and Connie McDermott. These slides and the paper and much more are available at the web link at the bottom of the screen. Back in 2013, we set out to answer what we thought was a fairly straightforward empirical question. There had been some confusion about whether private governance standards, specifically we were interested in forestry certification, was racing to the top, was racing to the bottom, whether these standards generally increased in regulatory stringency or decreased. Now, many assumed that the different claims about which standard was higher or lower, converging or diverging, was a result of the biases of those making those claims. And while certainly partially true, this wasn't the whole story. There were good scholars that had come to different conclusions. What we discovered through our research was that the reason why good scholars were able to come to different conclusions about certain standards being higher or lower or more similar or dissimilar was that we in the research community lacked common definitions of regulatory stringency. We found that the disagreements that people had come to were often rooted in the different concepts and measures they used to measure essentially the dependent variable. Are standards going up or down? What do we mean by high and low? To remedy this problem, we ended up engaging in a much larger project, essentially a methodological project to establish a framework of different types of regulatory stringency. This framework will then allow us to compare different programs across issues and over time. And there's much more about this in the paper and the literature we're engaging here, a lot of it from the public policy scholarship. But I'm going to focus on the high-level conclusions and the application to our case. If you want to read more about how we're engaging with various scholarly concepts, please go ahead and look at the paper. So we distinguish three often conflated measures of regulatory stringency: the scope of the policy, that is the number of issues that it covers; the prescriptiveness, that is how voluntary versus mandatory and substantive are the requirements; and their performance levels. So what exactly are the details of the specific requirements? These are sometimes called policy settings. So for example, the buffer, no harvesting buffer near a stream, or the exact protections required for an endangered species, or maybe the exact amount of carbon required to be maintained in a soil. These are different than the prescriptiveness, which is more about the means of the policy. To what extent are there mandatory requirements to do those things that we just talked about? Are there substantive thresholds? Do they state in very clear terms what must be achieved? And then once we have these types of measures, we can aggregate up to the level of the policy, the program level, and say how comprehensively are a certain set of issues addressed by this policy. How comprehensive are the prescriptive requirements, or maybe the less prescriptive requirements? So we propose that scholars should assess prescriptiveness and policy settings of a comprehensive set of possible issues a program might cover. This means asking the issue level questions we pose on the right-hand side of that table for each issue that might be covered by an existing or proposed program in the policy space, i.e. anything one might want to compare in their analysis. Now, this is a lot of work, and not all researchers may be able to do this. That's okay. Studies with a more limited scope can still be put in conversation with studies with a more comprehensive scope of analysis, but they need to be clear on the limitations of their scope. Exactly what are they addressing and what are they not addressing in the set of issues that could be compared to avoid the confusion that we saw earlier. There is, however, a critical advantage of doing a comprehensive scope. A comprehensive approach covering all possible issues allows us to assess the regulatory scope and prescriptiveness at the program level, that's the left-hand side of the table, and ask questions like, how comprehensive is the scope of this policy, this program, relative to others? What portion of issues have prescriptive requirements? Now, there are other dimensions of regulatory stringency, like the rigorousness of the auditing process and enforcement mechanisms, which are outside of the scope of this paper, but they fit into a sort of similar framework. We can imagine how they would fit in these cells. I'm going to spend most of my time illustrating this framework by applying it to our substantive case. We compare US forestry certification programs. Specifically, we especially focus on one founded by environmental groups, the Forest Stewardship Council, and another formed by the National Industry Association, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. These programs play a large role in regulating forestry in the United States. They cover about a third of commercially harvested timberland, including most corporate-owned timberland. Now, before we get into the results of the comparison, I want to have a little aside on what we mean by private regulation. That is, governing through market power and supply chains versus, or often alongside, public policies. So I'm giving you just the 1-minute version about this. There's much more of the history and the ways in which governing through markets has been used over most recent decades in the paper. So it starts, or it can start, with a dissatisfaction with some process that a business is engaged in. So some group or groups organize to change something about how a commodity is produced. Here we have a campaign from Greenpeace that is targeting the brand Kleenex as a way of improving forest practices by targeting the potential buyers of those forestry products. This then leads to demand for products that are certified by an organization that sets standards. So here we have Kleenex agreeing to source its products from a certified source and getting accolades from groups that give it the sort of credibility, in addition to the certification organization, that allow it to access that demand for that product and avoid the negative reputational costs of the campaign. This then gives power to regulate the practices of businesses to the organization doing the certifying. Now, these organizations can establish their regulatory standards in different ways. At the top, we see a picture of the Forest Stewardship Council members voting on changes to its standard. At the bottom, we see a picture of several of the members of the 18-member board of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. I couldn't get a picture of them voting, but there are different decision-making processes in these institutions. So now let's talk about the substance of the standards. We focused on 48 key social and environmental issues identified in a report that was commissioned for the US Green Building Council. So we have our comprehensive set of issues. And we assess each standard on those issues for the period between 2008 and 2016. So for example, as of 2016, the FSC US standards and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative standards were pretty different on the one key issue of clear cuts. We see that the SFI had significantly more permissive, flexible, less prescriptive, in our language, requirements on clear cuts, and they also have significantly higher settings, right? So the numerical level of allowed acreage is higher than in the FSC. Now, this is hard work in part because there's a lot of variation, and those black error bars on the bottom part of the graph show that the FSC has different limits in different regions and in different forest types. So even when we're trying to assess just one issue, there's still variation that we need to kind of average across in order to get a measure of that issue. Other issues are even more complicated. So consider one more example issue, harvesting near streams. How far away can you cut trees near streams? Seems like a simple question, but there's a lot of variation across different regions and forest types. Again, the pattern emerges. It's a similar issue where the industry-backed Sustainable Forestry Initiative has much less prescriptive requirements than the Forest Stewardship Council, which often has fairly strict requirements to not harvest a certain distance away from streams. I'm not going to go through the remaining 46 issues. Instead, I'm going to present some aggregate summaries of these across all issues. I want to return us to our measures of stringency. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have this framework that allows us to aggregate across different issues and compare over time. So for each of the 48 issues, we assessed the issue level questions. What are the specific requirements? What are the policy settings? For example, stream buffer zones, clear-cut acreage. We assessed how prescriptive those requirements are. Are they voluntary? Are they mandatory? Do they have mandatory substantive thresholds? And then we aggregated across all 48 issues and assessed the scope of the program. How many of the issues are covered, and the scope of the program, how many issues are covered with prescriptive requirements. A little more detail on what we mean by prescriptive. The key is that there are non-discretionary requirements, right? It's not voluntary and it's not flexible. In addition to that, things can be more prescriptive if they're based on a substantive threshold rather than a procedural requirement. On each dimension of regulatory stringency, we can imagine different relationships. So now that we're able to measure sort of increasing or decreasing in a standardized way, again, a program might be increasing on one dimension but decreasing on a different dimension or not changing. We can compare across programs and say, well, on this one dimension, prescriptiveness in the aggregate level, for example, these two programs can be compared by assessing the change in prescriptiveness of one and the change in prescriptiveness on another. So for each type of regulatory stringency, we have a different possible comparison, and that's why it's important to be clear about what exactly we are measuring. What is the dependent variable? In this table, there are two arrows indicating the possible trajectories of two programs over time. If we were comparing 3 or more programs, there'd be 3 or more arrows assessing the different trajectories on each dimension over time. So what do we see? With regard to policy scope, how many of those 48 issues are covered, we see that there's relatively little change over time. If we look at the darkest gray and the middle gray, i.e. requirements that had at least some prescriptive content, we see that the FSC and the SFI are actually very similar. FSC has a few more prescriptive requirements, and they have a lot more of the sort of most prescriptive, right? In a relative sense, when we compare these two, are they more prescriptive than the SFI? Well, when we're counting up the issues, that's more often true with the FSC, but it's also true that sometimes the SFI has more prescriptive standards. When it comes to policy prescriptiveness and an absolute change, how many issues became more prescriptive over this period, we see a different dynamic. This fits into the upwardly diverging cell, where we see a pattern where one standard increased at a higher rate than the other. This is mainly due to the 2010 US standard having significantly more prescriptive requirements, or prescriptive requirements on a large number of additional issues than the previous US template standard. The SFI sees smaller jumps as it changed its standard more times, but in fewer number of issues, leading to overall, again with our method aggregating across these issues, an overall slower rate of change. When it comes to policy settings, I can't really present aggregate results because most of these can only be compared qualitatively. So I suggest that you read the paper and read about how the policy settings, the specific details on each of these issues compare. I do want to highlight one qualitative comparison of the types of issues that each program emphasized. The activist-backed FSC program was more likely to have requirements, prescriptive requirements, and also to increase requirements that imposed costs on firms in order to achieve environmental values, especially. The industry-backed program, as I said, was actually more prescriptive than the activist-backed program on a certain set of issues. Those issues tended to be what we might call collective action problems for the industry: maintaining its image, having a trained workforce, utilizing products with best practices, having management plans. These types of activities, while beneficial and may have ecological and social values, they also contributed toward values that the industry may want to require of its members. There's more about this in the paper if you want to read about the different qualitative types of issues that changed in different ways. I'm going to leave it there, but if you would like to see the slides, the paper, or more, they're available at that link. There's a lot more. Thanks again.